Norfolk Rivers Trust webinar on the reintroduction of burbot to Norfolk's Fenland rivers. We've got this webinar booked for about an hour and a half, and the idea is to try and find out more how people feel about the issue, whether it's something people want to do, whether people have got any questions or concerns. And we want it to be very much an engagement thing. So by all means, if you haven't sent in questions, please do so, and we'll try and answer all of those. We've got a panel on it. So there's me, I'm Jonah, I'm the Operations Director at Norfolk Rivers Trust. We've got two other special guests who I'll introduce in a moment. And what we'll do is I'll give you a bit of a brief introduction to the burbot itself and what Norfolk Rivers Trust is trying to do and who we're working with. And then we'll hand over to Tom and Ian, who are the real burbot experts, to talk through some of the biology and the feasibility work to date. It's turned into something slightly different than we originally planned. It was going to be a village hall event where we're going to invite the communities of maybe Watton or Montford to come and see us, and river users in particular. Obviously not great timing to do that, so it's become a webinar, which means we've got a slightly wider audience. I know we've got some conservationists and fish ecologists on the webinar, so that's great news. So yeah, I think that's about us ready to go. So if there's anybody on there who doesn't know what a burbot is, the burbot, it's a native UK fish, a little bit like a freshwater cod. Present in the UK from the Ice Age until very recently, the 1960s, probably the 1970s, and widespread throughout most of the east of England rivers, the Trent Catchment and the Great Ouse Catchment in particular, but also up to Yorkshire, through the Norfolk Broadland rivers and down to the Welby as well, we know, and not been seen since 1969. It's an omnivore, so burbot will eat pretty much anything, and most things will eat burbot, and popular with anglers. Burbot have been the subject of reintroduction programs across Europe. Belgium in particular has been very successful, but also Germany. There are existing populations in Denmark and other European countries that we think are doing okay. And it's been something Norfolk Rivers Trust have been looking at for, I think, at least 6 years, almost as long as I've been here. We've been talking to guys, Carl Sayer from UCL in particular, Tom Worthington, who'll be on the webinar in a moment, about this fish and about its place in Norfolk's rivers, and about whether or not it's something we should be trying to bring back. And the perception seems to have changed gradually, I think. We've seen successful species reintroductions in Britain now, eagles and beavers and butterflies and various things. And it's got to the point where it's something people can conceive doing and are enthusiastic about. We can't be certain whether or not this will work. The science behind it's really quite complicated, and the only way to really know is to try it. So Tom will give us a bit of a background about the scientific feasibility in a few minutes. We've still got a lot of questions to answer. We're looking at water temperatures. We're particularly wanting responses from anglers, actually, to see how anglers feel about this. And we're looking at things like the connectivity of the habitat and whether these rivers are now appropriate to sustain populations of burbot. So it's something we've been looking at and talking about for about 6 years, and it's got really serious and started to gain support from Natural England in the last year or 18 months, which is a big step forward. And the next step is to see how people feel about it and to see whether it's something we can practically achieve. So what we want to do on the webinar, we very much want questions and responses, particularly relating to the Norfolk rivers, actually, if possible, if anybody can put those forwards. We've tried to get the right panelists to answer those questions. So I'll hand over to Ian and Tom. First of all, we've got Ian Welby on the webinar. Ian, if you could quickly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and history with burbot. Yeah.
Hi everybody. So my name's Ian Welby. I'm a private fisheries consultant, have been for 25 odd years, used to work for the Environment Agency and so on. I'm here because I'm fascinated by the burbot, and I was part of a burbot in 2006. 2006, I worked for a local college here called Brooksby Mountain College, and we joined a group of people to do some preliminary work on burbot. So we imported some in February of 2006 to do two main things. One, to maintain that population in research systems to see how we fared with that, and then to adapt a spawning protocol, predominantly to verify that eggs can be hatched from birds, reduce them to surviving and hatch rate to produce fry at normal English winter temperatures. So we set our systems up and then kept the fish at the ambient temperature of the local river. Officially spawned them, took the eggs, and took all the eggs all the way through to hatch and to first feed at normal ambient temperatures. We ended up producing, well, somewhere in the region of 500 fish from 500 hatchlings from spawning males. And that was the purpose of the project, and from that point of view, it was a success. Tom will talk you part through the rest of the project, which was to look at various other aspects of the burbot and the possibilities of reintroduction. There's a misunderstanding sometimes about our project. The fish that came to us were never intended to go out into the wild, and none of the progeny were ever intended to go out into the wild. That was a misconception. And the fish, once we'd finished with them in 2007, the remaining fish went in London, and we closed the project in 2007. So that's my predominant relationship with burbot, should I say. And I'll continue after Tom's comments about our thoughts on fish for this particular project, should we get to that point.
Thank you very much, Ian. Next on the panel, we've got Dr. Tom Worthington, currently at University of Cambridge, and I think the leader of England's burbot science to date. Tom's PhD was in the feasibility of the reintroduction of burbot to the UK. Tom, Tom will take us through a presentation in a moment. After that, we'll move on to questions, some of which you've already sent in, and some of which hopefully you can send in. But Tom, could you introduce yourself and go on to your presentation, please?
Okay, yeah. Okay, so thank you to everyone who's joined us this afternoon. As I said, my name is Tom Worthington, and I'm a research associate at the University of Cambridge, where I'm based in the conservation science group. And my background is in aquatic ecology. Generally, I look at conservation and reintroduction and restoration of species and organisms at kind of broad spatial scales. The work I'm going to talk about this afternoon was, as Jonah said, part of my PhD, which I did and finished in 2010 at the University of Southampton. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank the funders, which were the Trent Rivers Trust and the Esme Fairbairn Foundation. So when we think about species reintroduction, we're thinking about the intentional movement and release of an organism or species inside what was once its historic range, and from where it's now disappeared. And if we think about a UK perspective, as Jonah mentioned, we've had some quite well-known reintroductions, the white-tailed seagull to the Western Isles probably being one of the most famous. That's now been recreated on the Isle of Wight, some butterfly species, and then trial reintroductions of things like the beaver and the great bustard, which have been over multiple rivers for the European beaver, but it's not been without its controversies. There's been a large amount of issues associated with angling and also flooding of farmland. There's also been feasibility studies for a number of other species, things like the European wolf and the European lynx. And when you look at the species which we've tended to focus on in the UK, what you'll kind of notice is they're often birds and they're often mammals, and they're often large and charismatic. So you get things like the white-tailed seagull or the great bustard, these big species that are generally going to get noticed, or species that are, going to get large amounts of public support, things like the European beaver or the European lynx. I mean, it's hard not to like photos when you see that. When we look at restoration as a whole across the globe, freshwater systems have been generally overlooked. There's not been huge numbers of fish restoration. And maybe the species we're talking about today has kind of somewhat of an identity crisis. It's maybe not the most attractive species that you're ever going to see. Large parts of the population are never going to see it unless you are going to go and target as an angler if it was out there. But it doesn't mean it's not important. And I think the key thing with the burbot is that it has this opportunity to be kind of a target species for wider river restoration and wetland restoration across the fenland region. It's a species that needs certain types of habitat, and these habitats have been underrepresented and degraded in our wetlands for quite a number of years. To give you a kind of quick background on the species, as Jonah said, it's the only truly freshwater cod. It's quite unusual from that point of view, and it has this huge distribution. It's found throughout the cold latitudes of North America, Europe and Asia, down to around 4 degrees north. It has the second largest distribution of any freshwater fish, it's thought, apart behind the northern pike. So it's covering a large portion of the northern hemisphere. However, it's been extirpated or threatened across much of its range. If we look at Western Europe, for example, and this is data from a review paper in 2009, you can see that in Western Europe, so the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, the species is either imperiled, vulnerable, or extinct. And so a lot of these areas have seen conservation programs put in place to try and restore burbot populations. So what are some of the factors that may lead to this species being threatened across multiple rivers? Well, it has a preference for low water temperatures. You'd expect that. It's a northern latitude species. In the summer, it's generally found below 13 degrees C, but it can actually tolerate much higher than that. That's been shown throughout a lot of the lowland rivers in Europe. And it also spawns during cold water periods. It requires clean, well-oxygenated water. It's maybe not quite as picky as some of the salmonids like salmon and trout, but still water quality is an issue, and I'll go on to that in a minute. And in terms of its biology, it's an ambush hunter. It will eat most things. It hides in rocks and crevices and ambushes its prey. And juveniles tend to be eating invertebrates, crustaceans and mollusks, and then fish and crayfish become more a large part of the diet as you move forward. When we think about reintroduction, it's often framed around this document, which is the IUCN's Guidelines for Reintroductions and Conservation Translocation. And this is the information that the UK government will want to see in order to think about the feasibility of reintroducing any species within the UK, be it beaver, be it a white-tailed seagull, or be it the burbot. And it sets the framework for undertaking a species reintroduction. And it moves beyond just looking at the biological feasibility. It covers things like that, for example, habitat, which I'll talk about, climate requirements and founder populations, to things like the social feasibility and the regulatory framework within which you need to set. So at the top of the next few of these slides, in blue italics, you'll see some excerpts from the IUCN guidelines. And the first one is this idea of reintroducing a species within its historic range. For the burbot, we had no historical survey data. It went extinct probably around 1969, 1970. The last recorded capture is in the University of Cambridge Museum, which is just about a mile down the road from where I am currently. But to sort of recreate that distribution, we used around 200 references to map the former distribution within English rivers. And these ranged from things like 12th century farmland practices to early fishing works from the 16th century looking at fishing in an area. More recent magazines and newspaper articles looking at the species extinction. And to give you an example, this is from Jonathan Couch's beautiful work on the history of the fishes of the British Isles. It's found in the rivers of Yorkshire, Durham, Norfolk, Lincolnshire and Cambridge. And so from there, we can recreate where we think the burbot was found. And we identified 42 rivers, which we were really confident once held burbot populations. We split those into 4 main areas, and I'll talk about those a bit more in a minute. But there were also a number of other rivers where it was highlighted as being potentially present, but we discounted a number of those because it's probably the wrong species, or it was just a mistake in terms of the river name, and these are shown in green. The only one where we had some doubt over whether it was present or not is the one down the south, the River Thames. But we classified the burbot into 4 main areas. So we looked at the Yorkshire rivers in the north, so those are the ones that are mainly draining down into the Humber from the north, but also a couple that drain a bit further north. The Trent catchment and its tributaries draining into the Humber from the south. The area we're kind of focusing within this kind of discussion, which is these washland rivers, the ones that flow into the Wash from different sides, and then a few smaller rivers that flow into the North Sea through Norfolk and Suffolk. We also overlaid the position of where archaeological digs had recovered burbot bones from predominantly people using these to be a food source. And what's kind of interesting, we also got 4 from the River Thames. So we're still not sure whether that river always had burbot in it. We know that they were stopped in there in around about the 18th century, but whether it was ever a natural population in that river. One of the really key things, and we had a question about this earlier, and hopefully I'll address some of this now, is this idea of trying to remove whatever the threats were that caused the burbot to go extinct in the first place. As I said, we didn't have any data on the species and to look at its decline over time. So what we did was use that same historic literature to try and map the anecdotes as they move through time. And if we take these examples that I've shown on the slide, what you can see that in the 18th and mid-19th century, it goes from being fairly common, 40 are caught in a single night, to around the turn of the 20th century being rather scarce and local, to the mid-20th century being now becoming very rare. So you get this idea of its change over time. And if you map this onto the different catchments, what you can see is it changes through time when we look at the historic literature. But what's also of note is there's a difference between the Trent and also the Fenland and the Yorkshire rivers. They seem to have gone into decline much later than the Trent catchment itself. And when we model that, we did a binary logistic model to try and have a look at the change over time. And we calculated that it went into decline and towards extinction for the overall population in about 1907. For the Trent, it was considerably earlier, around 1894, and a bit later for the Fenland and Yorkshire rivers, 1915, 1920. So then that leads us to be able to start to look at the factors that may have led to this extinction. And we considered a range of different things. I'm going to talk about 3 mainly today, which are habitat loss, pollution, and climate change. But things like overfishing were also considered. It's been shown to be on sale in different markets, and the potential for a disease outbreak. But we thought these were unlikely to be the key causes. So picking the one that I think is probably one of the key drivers in terms of why the burbot went extinct, particularly in these big lowland rivers. This is a picture from the Great Level past the Fens, and this shows the before photo, before river modification works. And what you can see is it looks like a relatively natural functioning river. You can imagine under high flows there would be some lateral connectivity onto the floodplain in this area. If we fast forward to the after the modification, you can see this huge change in the river. It's now much deeper, it's now much wider, the banks are steeper, but also you get these large embankments on either side. So the river has now gone from being part of its surrounding environment to just being a conduit for moving water to the coastline. And you can see that along many of the rivers within the UK today. We tried to quantify that for 3 target rivers. This is for the River Trent, just outside Nottingham, at Colic Sluice. And if we look at where the river is now, this is the flow line showing the main channel as it moves through. If we go back to 1901, what you can see is where the river used to be, and we've lost that entire meander from across from that section. And what you might not be able to work out, but what's marked on the map is some marshlands that go aside the river, but also some fields that highlight as being liable to flooding. So this lateral connectivity that I'm going to keep coming back to. We tried to quantify that, as I said. I estimated that at least 17 kilometres of the trend had been removed from river channelization. And for the River Yorkshire Derwent, that was about 25% of the original channel was reduced, reducing its sinuosity, its wiggliness by about 8.5%. And to give you an example of this, this is where the Derwent is currently. And what you probably pick up straight away is rivers don't tend to flow in those nice straight lines. And what you also might be able to see is by each side of the channel is this identification of these big embankments by those dotted lines. If we overlay where the channel was historically, you can see how much of the habitat that's been lost and how much that is likely to have changed the ecology of the river. We also looked at pollution. As I said earlier, the species needs clean, well-oxygenated water. And in the Industrial Revolution, this led to large inputs from factories, but also from local population, that led to gross pollution of our lowland rivers, to the extent that rivers such as the Trent were devoid of aquatic life for tens of kilometres through downstream from Birmingham and Stoke-on-Trent. So wiping out any aquatic life, let alone anything that has this need for good water quality. On the positive side, what we've seen across most of the UK's rivers is this improvement in water quality from about the 60s and 70s onwards, to the extent where you're getting salmon returning to many of these big lowland industrial rivers. So we've moved past that as a potential issue for pollution as an overall thing across the distribution for many of the rivers. The last fact that I wanted to highlight, and Ian touched about this in terms of the spawning of the burbot. It spawns between January and February, and this is related to water temperatures below about 4 degrees. It may be slightly higher, and some newer work has suggested it may be as high as 6 degrees that it's spawning. What we did was try to model a change in the number of days per year of 4 degrees or less throughout the time period from 1800 to 2000. And as you can see, they decline as we move through the time period, but you're still getting around 20 days per year. Whether that's enough, that's something that we will need to study in the future to sort of quantify how much thermal habitat there is for the species. On a slightly more positive note, we have removed kind of one thermal issue that tended to be a problem on some of these big rivers. This is the river water temperatures in January and February for the River Trent. And as you move from the left, which is the upstream end, downstream through Nottingham up to Kelham, you can see this huge increase in winter temperatures as you move downstream. And the main driver for this, well, is from the power stations. This actually is from the River Severn, and showing one of the power stations there. I think this one's at Ironbridge. And the direct water inputs from the power station leading to the river basically steaming during the winter because of the change in the ambient temperature. And if we overlay the position of the power stations, you can see the impact it had in that area. Moving on to one of the key considerations, and this is something that all reintroductions have to look at in kind of real detail, is this idea of having habitat that suits all life stages of the species. This is from some great work by Margaret Bunzel-Drucker and colleagues from the River Lippe in Germany, where they've been doing some specific restoration aimed at improving burbot habitat, but also for other species. They've created this diagram where they think the different life stages use different habitats. So adult fish, the general feeling is they're maybe not particularly choosy. They just need some cover from which to launch their ambush hunting. So this can be things like tree roots or vegetation. When we did some electrofishing in the Lippe, it was actually man-made boulders that were there to protect the bank foot line. So they were hiding in there and coming out to prey on fish and invertebrates from there. It's more the larvae and the egg stages that are thought to be the bottleneck for the burbot. They're thought to spawn in these tributary flood channels, and the eggs and larvae are then washed down into these inundated floodplain channels and so forth. If we look at the Lipper, this is an aerial photo. What they did basically was they tried to raise the bottom of the river. So they made it back wider again, they made it shallower and allowed that connectivity so the water could then go sideways. And as you can see from the picture, this allows this on-channel, on floodplain habitat for the species. It should be noted that the larvae of burbot are absolutely minute, they're like any sort of cod. So under high flows in the main channel, there was a large danger that they would be washed downstream. We did habitat quantification to try and look at adult and spawning habitat within the rivers of the historic range in total, looking at things like tree roots and cobbles for the adults, but spawning habitat in terms of backwaters and fens. And the area that came out as being the most suitable was this area of the fenlands, particularly around the lower ends of the Wissey and those other small rivers. And this is a photo that Jonah sent me that shows this kind of connectivity on the lower end of the Wissey. So this off-channel habitat that may be suitable for the juvenile stages of the burbot. And I think, I mentioned this earlier, and I think this fits really nicely within what's been put forward as the wetland vision. In dark purple, we have the current extent of wetlands in the UK. And what we can see is they're generally confined to these upland areas and a bit in the Somerset levels and also the New Forest. But the potential within the fenland area is huge to restore some of this natural functioning of these wetlands, but also the natural functioning of the rivers. And I think, you know, burbot is one of those species, it could be used to look at it in terms of improving habitat for various different fish species, but also for invertebrates, for plant species, for birds that use these wetland habitats. And it could almost become this kind of target species for doing wetland restoration. So this is another question that was raised earlier about the source populations. So generally it's thought that the source population should come from the closest source that's still available, as they're more likely to be ecologically suited to the habitat. Obviously, we had no original UK burbot with which to test, but what we did have was some museum specimens. This is one from the Woollerton Park Museum in Nottingham. We also had a couple from the University of Cambridge, University of Oxford Natural History Museum, and we tested the genetics of these species to see how they fitted in with the global distribution. So this is work by Jeroen van Hout from the University of Leuven, who did his PhD on burbot genetics. And he mapped the different glacial races across the globe, but in this figure, across Europe. And you can see you get these 4 different distinct races. So the Northern European one, the one in the Baltic Sea area, which is kind of a mixing population, the Central European, and then the Western European. And when we started out this, we assumed that the UK burbot would be part of that Western European group. So what we did was we tried to add our specimens into that genetic tree. This is obviously made more difficult by having, you know, historic material that is not necessarily always the greatest for DNA extraction. What we found was that whilst it was closely related to the Western European group, and that would be the obvious source population, it was actually a distinct glacial race. And it's thought that it may have survived the last glacial maximum in UK rivers, which is unusual for most freshwater species. Just to finish up with, I think we've highlighted already that, you know, this should be more than just an ecological process. It should look at the views of local communities and their values, but also some of the socioeconomic circumstances. When we did this research previously, we got large amounts of press coverage, and we also actually made it onto Have I Got News for You in the Missing Words round. which was somewhat of a shock when you're trying to finish your PhD, but that comes up on a Friday evening, but there we go. But we did a study to see what people's views were, and this is very much kind of at the broad scale. So this is online, but also in Nottingham and Southampton, to see what people thought about the reintroduction. And generally, it was fairly positive. Obviously, when you zero in on an area where you want to start thinking about possibly trialling a reintroduction, it's important to get the ideas of the local community. And just as a quick aside, it was kind of interesting that the angling community that we talked to saw this as more as a potential for an angling species more than, say, some of the other groups. So just to go over what I've covered, we have a good idea of where the species was and have some idea of what potentially led to its extinction. It's likely to be a combination of things like gross pollution in some areas, habitat loss, and with the potential of climate change into the future maybe being somewhat an issue. Some of those factors have been reduced, such as pollution. Some of those factors are being reduced, such as this increase in river restoration. And we have a good idea of some of the habitat requirements of the species. So with that, I just again like to thank the funders, plus my two PhD supervisors, Paul and Patrick. We should also highlight Keith Easton, who was instrumental in setting up this project and was the back coordinator for the species for quite a long time, and everyone who gave me data. Thank you very much.
Tom, thank you very, very much for that. That was fantastic. I think before we get onto the questions, just to add to that, I think what gives us hope as a Rivers Trust and a group of burbot enthusiasts is, I think pollution obviously was a major threat, and I think and I hope we're past the worst of that. The really toxic agri-chemicals are gone. Sewage works generally have improved hugely, and there's little to no industrial pollution in the majority of the Fenland rivers, at least now. So I think in terms of water quality, we're hopefully looking pretty good. And we're also looking at this on the back of at least 10 years worth of river restoration on these rivers, on the Cam and the Wissey and the Thet and the Little Ouse in particular. There's been an awful lot of river restoration work aimed at improving habitat generally, but all that would benefit burbot. A lot of that is about allowing water to spill back onto floodplains and making rivers messy again and creating pools with tree roots in them where the adult burbot can hang out, and little floodplain ponds where the larvae can develop before they're washed back into the river. So I think there's certainly a lot to be positive about, and I think we've between us certainly addressed a lot of the possible reasons for decline and extinction. So I think it's looking very, very positive. I can see we've got questions coming in, and we've also had some questions emailed in. This is a bit of a test of how good at webinars we are, but let's see if we can have a go at the first question. So we have a question from Kathy Hughes. Which water quality elements do you think burbot are most sensitive to? Tom or Ian, either of you want to take that?
From the literature, and the burbot is not a species that's been studied in as great detail as many others, oxygen was one of the areas that was highlighted, and that's why we focus on that. We also looked at things like pH as well, but we tried to balance what we thought affected the species with what was the available data. And I think, in terms of oxygen, for example, the river I worked on quite a lot was the River Trent. The water quality now allows salmon to move upstream through that areas. At one point, you were getting, basically zero oxygen in certain areas downstream. So I think in those areas, there has been a huge increase in the water quality. That said, I do take the second point about what's happening in rural rivers, and I think the burbot hasn't been studied in as great detail as a number of other species, particularly things like the salmon.
I think to add to that, so the second part of that question was, has water quality really improved in rural rivers? Hard to quantify, but I think one of the threats to burbot was dissolved oxygen level. A lot of that potential problems coming from the small rural sewage works. And on the Wissey in particular, that's something we're working very hard with Anglian Water on, to look at those small sewage works and reduce the amount of nutrients coming into the rivers, which are a major cause of oxygen depletion. So again, very hard to quantify, but I think cause to be hopeful. And the same with the diffuse agricultural pollution, agricultural practices improving massively, things like slurry storage and spreading, the runoff of silt and nutrients and fertilizers into the river. And I think there's so much positive work gone on there that I think it's very, very hopeful. Ian, have you got anything you'd like to add to?
No, I think Tom covered it very well. The predominant one is dissolved oxygen. It's the one we know the best about, and all those rivers had significant problems with CO from a whole variety of different problems, mostly industrial runoff, and even the small rural rivers tended to end up in the highly polluted rivers like the Trent.
Thank you very much, Ian and Tom. I'm going multi-platform and moving onto my phone to look at the questions that were emailed in. So we've already answered some of these through Tom's presentation, but I think it's maybe worth just having a second look at them. So the next question is, what were the drivers that led to the Burbot's extirpation in England, and what measures have been taken to reduce or eliminate them from reintroduction? Water quality, I think we've covered as much as we can. I just want to add to that, we've still got temperature loggers out, there's work going on. And one of the things we're hoping to do is map oxygen and temperature levels and refugia in the river through summer and winter months. So there's a fair bit more to learn there. We've said a little bit about habitat improvement and how habitat loss may have been a cause for the extirpation. And again, not easily quantified, but one of the things that gives us hope is partly the change in river management and maintenance, and partly the amount of conservation work that's been put in. So the next question, what was the process by which the stock for reintroduction was chosen? We haven't chosen a stock for reintroduction, although going back to Tom's presentation, the genetic background for that work is there. We've got several options to look at. We've been talking to quite a few hatcheries in Belgium and Germany in particular, who've been able to offer us Burbot stock, and part of the feasibility and project plan will be looking at those to see which we think are the most appropriate genetic matches for what we had. So no stock chosen as yet, but we've got a pretty good...
Can I just interrupt on that bit, Jonah?
Yeah, go on in.
Yeah, the donor population thing, there's a couple of things that are absolutely vital when we're choosing that base every decision we make when we come to the donor population. The first ones we've covered, which are the fish are genetically suitable. There shouldn't be any risk to the donor populations, so we can't take them from the wild, or that donor population can't be impacted by what we do. And probably the most important is there should be no risk to the recipient population. So the population in the UK. So the first thing we've done for that, which Jonah has done, which is to absolutely make sure that there aren't any burbot left. So doing eDNA studies to make sure that there are, so we can't damage that population. And the final one, which is very key to understand, is the disease risk. That we can't allow what we do to introduce a disease risk to native populations of fish. And then the legislation makes that imperative, but it's also obviously absolutely imperative for this project. My career is based largely on prevention of disease movements around the UK. So we're looking at farm populations which cover a lot of that. We're looking at the biosecurity of those farm populations so that we know the farm populations are secure from any disease risk. and looking at eggs or fry as the donor organism that actually crosses the geographical boundary of English Channel to again essentially eliminate that risk completely. And those are our sort of tools, if you like, that we would put into obtaining fish population.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, actually, and something that Natural England quite rightly recommended that we do that I haven't mentioned yet was a eDNA survey of the river, just to try to be absolutely sure that we're looking at the right thing here, to try and be absolutely sure that there are no burbot left. No burbot have been caught since 1968 or 9, and there's been no sign of them in the Fenland rivers, despite decades and decades of Environment Agency surveys and recreational angling, obviously. But the last thing we'd want to do is harm an existing population. So we're doing eDNA surveys at the moment with the University of Hull, just to try and make sure that there are no traces of burbot left hanging on in those rivers. I think we've got a new question come in. So the last of the questions that were emailed in, which we've kind of just answered actually, are there any descendants of the original population that are part of the reintroduction programme? No, not as far as we're aware of. If we have a different answer sometime in the summer, then that'll be quite big news.
Yeah.
So no, we don't think there are any remaining burbot left that we can work from. We've got a couple of new questions coming in. By all means, send us anything you've still got. Just let me work my way through these. Would we be looking at... Sorry, Ian, go on.
There's a couple coming on the chat as well. A couple more questions.
Okay. Tom, if I work through the ones that have come on Q&A, could you just have a brief look at the chat ones while I'm going through these?
Yeah.
So where are we? On the Q&A, we've got a question about Water Framework Directive status and the status of the water bodies we'd reintroduce them to, please. Yes, definitely. We use that information. So the Water Framework Directive is used to categorise the health of all European rivers, and it's a massive Environment Agency database with all kinds of parameters listed, water quality, different measures of habitat quality. And yeah, that's certainly something we look at to highlight problems. And I imagine some of that data is fed into Tom's study as well. So yes, that is something we have used and will use. And I think we've got one more question here. 2 more questions. Do we know how water quality and habitat of the secure European populations differ from these less secure populations? Not completely, no. Again, that's something else we're doing, working with the European partners to gather as much information on their rivers as we can. Tom, do you know any more about the water quality of the European rivers?
I'm thinking that generally a lot of, if we look at the map that I showed, that it's these big lowland rivers in Western Europe where you've got high populations and largely high industrial inputs, are likely to have similar histories as the UK rivers. So I think those populations are likely to be imperiled due to the same factors that we saw in the UK. I'm not sure anyone's ever done a comparative study across the different populations, and that's definitely an interesting point. But I think this idea of improving water quality across European rivers, and also this push to a more kind of holistic management of rivers within their surrounding habitat, has led to a number of these conservation / reintroduction efforts in Belgium, in Germany, and in the Netherlands.
We've got one very good technical question just come in. Are there plans for biotic enrichment for establishing burbot in the designated ranges, such as the addition of native food organisms for different life stages, or the temporary relocation of predators? No, is the brief answer. We had an interesting conversation with the guys who've done the restocking of the Belgian rivers, and they think one of their burbot populations might be limited by the productivity of the river. They've got a slightly acidic sand-fed river with low natural productivity. I can't imagine that would be a problem in the fen rivers. They're usually pretty richly productive, I would say. So no. With regards to the predators, I think pretty much everything in these rivers will eat burbot, young burbot, and I think burbot will eat pretty much everything in the rivers. I don't think there's any specific predator that would be a threat to them. And they've been gone for an absolutely tiny part of the history of these rivers. So I think this should fit very well with the current ecology.
So there was a couple of questions in the chat, which were for people who object to the reintroduction, what are the main issues? When we did the study, there wasn't too many people who objected to the reintroduction, but previously a lot of it has been around this idea of reintroducing a new predator into areas where people fish for coarse fish or for salmonids. And that's completely understandable, and is one of those things where I talked about earlier, you know, this idea that taking into account the views of local people and local stakeholders is crucially important within any reintroduction. It's been seen in other reintroductions that when they haven't done that, that's caused bad feeling and, you know, has sort of stymied some of the process in terms of looking at restoration. Then there was a question about, can the farm populations be considered as ecologically fit as the wild populations? Ian, do you want to?
Yeah, yes, I saw that one. The simple answer is no. The first two points to that. One is that, as I said, the absolute must for the project is to reduce that risk of danger of introduced parasites and diseases. So the farm population wins on that one. And the other is that these aren't farm populations like you would expect. They're literally only going to be one generation, possibly two generations from wild. So they're not farm populations that have been farmed for generations and generations. There will be potential issue with the sort of survival of the fittest aspects, that on a farm you can get all the fry to survive relatively easily, and you're not getting that some natural selection you get in a river system or the natural system. But we would hope that would be weeded out fairly quickly within any population that was reintroduced.
And then there was a question about, have there ever been records of burbot in the southwest? Yes, I don't think they were necessarily correct. There were some records from the Severn, but it was more kind of an offhand comment. There was also a record from somewhere near Plymouth, but from all the evidence that anyone looking at that has, that it was just a misidentification of another species. It's generally felt that the rivers that made up the burbot's region were these ones that were flowing east into the North Sea that connected up with the Rhine basin after kind of glacial period. So the rivers of the Rhine connected with a number of the UK rivers, and then as the ice sheets moved out, they got disconnected, and then the burbot was then in those eastern English rivers. So we're fairly confident on the distribution of the species, with the one potential of the Thames. And I think at the moment there's still issues around the Thames in terms of, you know, some of the water quality in the area. So it would seem, you know, not a sensible area to be considering, given that we're not sure about it as part of the distribution, and also some of the ongoing kind of issues with water quality.
We've got another question from one of our favourite fisheries biologists, Cathy Hughes, about hard releases versus soft releases. A hard release being where you just release the fish straight into the wild, which is certainly what I had in mind, as opposed to a soft release where you maybe release them into a pen, feed them on slowly, and release them slowly over time. So the plan to date would be to bring them over as very young fish, and probably rear them to a slightly larger size in a hatchery facility in Norfolk, and then release them as fry or fingerlings or something like that. A soft release into the river, if I'm understanding that correctly. That's something I certainly haven't thought about. I don't know if Ian or Tom have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would suggest that if everything being equal and a perfect conditions, it would be nice to take eggs and literally place the eggs into those off-river pools and stuff, and allow them to hatch in situ and as a soft release pen essentially, and that gives you the whole spectrum. You know, they have to be fit to survive the whole way through their system before they can get to adulthood. I suspect that will be very difficult to organize, and the logistics of it might take that out, but that would be the favored method. It's sort of, if you do a hard release with adults or sub-adults and allow them to reach adulthood, then the first spawning then becomes the soft release, because they must find the suitable habitat to spawn in, and they would soon die out if your release was inappropriate. And I suspect that will be the route that we go down in the end, is to release sub-adults, so a year-old fry, because logistically that makes the most sense. And then if they can reproduce, you get your soft release at that point. Soft release is just a way of helping to adapt the animal to the environment.
Another good question about the practicalities of doing this. I know I've skipped over a question from Johan here. I'll be back to that in a second. Some salmon conservationists freeze milk and eggs as a genetic backup. And are there plans to set up a backup captive population or a similar gene bank over the course of the project? We hadn't thought of freezing the eggs or the milk, although that is a possibility. What we had considered is holding back some of the young fish that we import and raising those on as our own brood stock. As Ian said, we know that they will over time develop issues of becoming hatchery reared and hatchery fit fish, and maybe we'll be able to supplement that stock with stock that we recatch from the river or something like that. So yeah, certainly thoughts of having our own backup captive, maybe not populations, but certainly brood stock. But whether or not we freeze milk and eggs, something we haven't considered yet. So to step back a couple of questions to Johan from Belgium, who's given us an awful lot of help here. The temperature of the small connected waters is more important than the temperature of the river. At these ponds, the water stagnates and cools down much better. It is here that the eggs develop. Yes, and we have temperature loggers, and we soon will have oxygen loggers out in those small connected backwaters. We're hoping to do some mapping work to see how accessible they are. So yeah, that's all stuff we're looking at. Thank you very much. Can anybody see any questions or chats that I've missed? Or has anybody got any final thoughts or comments? You've got a minute or two to get things into us. So if nothing appears in the next couple of minutes, thank you very much to everybody who's been in on this. And thank you for the questions and feedback. Actually, that's been really interesting and raised a few things that I certainly hadn't considered. It looks like we are done for questions and feedback chat. So I just want to say thank you very much to everybody who's participated and listened in. We realise we're a little bit limited in the audience because of the corona situation that we're in, and this is certainly something that we'd like to bring out to the communities that use these rivers over the next few months. So we'll certainly try and do that. I think we've got one more question in possibly. Oh no, that's just a thanks from Kathy. Kathy, thank you for attending and being part of it. So in that case, I'd just like to say thank you very much to Ursula, who's organised and administered the whole thing for us. Thank you, Ursula. And thank you very much to our Burbot experts, Ian and Tom. That's been absolutely fantastic help, thank you. And I hope that's answered a lot of people's questions. Do keep an eye on the Norfolk Rivers Trust website and social media to see what we're up to. It's certainly going to be a long process, but we're trying to
just give a final thought, Jonah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, just that for me, this project is actually about fish and the fish species, and that's really rare. It's very rare for a conservation organisation to be interested in fish for the fish's sake, for their importance to the environment itself, not just as an angling species or a species for food for bitterns or whatever it is. And I think that's absolutely key to this. This is about fish for fish's sake, for their importance to the whole wider environment, and something to be considered when thinking about this project. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely bang on. For us, the Burbot's very much something that should be there. It's part of the ecosystem. It's part of our native wildlife, and it's part of the life in these rivers. And that's very much why we're doing it. We do have one final question. Are there plans to work with or create citizen science groups that can help in the monitoring of the reintroduced population? Not yet for the Burbot. I think if we're successful with the hatchery plans, that there'll be quite a bit of input from the local agricultural college, and we're hoping to use their students to monitor. It's quite a busy area for anglers, I think. So we'd certainly hope for some angler participation and reports back. So at the moment, again, it's fairly early stages for the project. At the moment, we've been working up a very academic monitoring program based on universities carrying out their research and producing peer-reviewed reports for the project. But yeah, we'd absolutely like to engage the community further and get more people involved. Yeah. Any final thoughts from the panel? No? Okay, thank you very much again, Tom. Thank you very much again, Ian, and thank you very much, Ursula. And thank you to all our guests, and we will do our very best to keep everybody updated on how we get on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.